Success can be defeating. Now, that may sound odd, but in many circumstances it is the case. Success can be defeating. You see, people who are used to success often can't cope with failure or even difficulty in trying to accomplish something. They see success as a reward or blessing for their own efforts, so that when they fail or struggle, they quickly conclude that they must be doing something wrong or they're misguided. And then they may feel abandoned or worthless. And then they often give up on the enterprise, preferring to look for something else at which they can succeed. I was listening to a radio program earlier this week, and there was a commentator talking about millennials who grew up in affluent households. And he pointed out that many of these young people were constantly told that they were special, and they received awards just for participating in events, even if they came in last. And as the first generation to be completely immersed in technology, they became accustomed to instant gratification. As a result, he noted, many of these millennials are struggling now in the workplace. Nobody is treating them any more specially than they treat anyone else. And they don't get rewarded just for participating. And they don't receive immediate gratification for their efforts at work. And so many millennials have held multiple jobs in short periods of time. They bounce around from one apartment to the next, and they hesitate to enter into committed relationships. You see, for some of these young people, having grown up with everything coming to them easily, having in essence been treated as successes in everything they did, they're now struggling in a world that doesn't treat them that way. You see, success can be defeating. Now, today we celebrate the Feast of the Transfiguration, and we are reading the story from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, if you have your Bibles, because we're going to be flipping around a little bit for today's Bible study. So most of us are familiar with the story. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to a high mountain, and there he is transfigured before them. Matthew tells us that his face shines like the sun, and his clothes become white as light. And then Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus, and they begin conversing. And Peter is so taken by the event that he wants to preserve it by building 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But while he's still proposing this, a bright cloud comes over them, and from the cloud they hear a voice. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And at that, the 3 disciples fall prostrate on the ground. Jesus touches them and lifts them up. And when they look around, there is no one then but Jesus alone. And then Matthew tells us something a little bit curious. He says, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, "Do not tell the vision to anyone until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Do not tell anyone. Now, that's not the first time Jesus says to his disciples or to others, "Do not tell anyone." Have you noticed that? If you flip back to chapter 8, the very beginning, Jesus heals a leper. A wonderful thing. And yet, no sooner does he heal the leper than in verse 4 he says, "See that you tell no one." In the chapter just before the Transfiguration, Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And no sooner than he says that, Jesus says, then he strictly ordered his disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah. Have you noticed that in the other Gospels as well? Jesus heals somebody, he does something magnificent, or somebody notices something about him and says that he's the Son of God or the Messiah, and he turns around and he says, "Do not tell anyone." Have you ever wondered why? Well, even if you haven't, I'm going to tell you. That response of Jesus, not to tell anyone, is what scholars call the messianic secret. Okay, messianic from Messiah. It usually occurs in the context in which Jesus is identified as the Messiah. And then Jesus says, "Tell no one." So this is called the messianic secret. And as I said, it occurs after Jesus performs a miracle or someone identifies him as the Messiah. And most scholars believe that Jesus does this because he's afraid that if people think that he is the Messiah solely because of the magnificent deeds that he does, then they will abandon him when he finally suffers and dies on the cross. You see, Jesus cannot afford for us to think that success is what it's all about. And so he needs us to hear the whole story before we can conclude that he is the Messiah. Because his identity as the Messiah includes both his magnificent power and authority and also his suffering and death. And it really plays itself out in the way Matthew presents to us this story of the Transfiguration. You see, if you flip back to chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel, you'll see that Jesus is offering his disciples a series of parables about the kingdom of heaven. And we've been hearing those parables these last few weeks. And after Jesus finishes his teaching of what the kingdom of heaven is like, then he begins a series of miracles, as in essence to bring about the kingdom of heaven in the midst of the people. So that if you look, for example, at chapter 14, Jesus' first major miracle after these teachings is the feeding of the 5,000 with the few loaves and fish. And then he no sooner does that than he walks on water. And after he does that, he performs a series of healings from Gennesaret to Tyre and Sidon. And then after that, he feeds another 4,000 people. These are all magnificent deeds. And it's after all of those deeds that Jesus says to his disciples, "Now, who do people say that I am?" And of course, we get the response. Some say you are Elijah, some say you are John the Baptist, others say you are the prophet. And then he says to them, "But you, who do you say that I am?" And Peter declares, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then right away, Jesus says, "Do not tell anyone." Because he adds to that, because the Son of Man must now go to Jerusalem, and he must suffer and die at the hands of the scribes. And on the third day, he will rise again. And so what's Peter's first response? "God forbid that this should happen to you, because you have just demonstrated yourself to be such a powerful and mighty person. You are clearly the Son of God. You cannot suffer and die." And what is Jesus' response? "Get behind me, Satan, because you are thinking not as God thinks, but as human beings think." You see, Peter wants to separate out success and define glory as simply being success. And so Jesus then takes him and James and John up the mountainside. And at this point, they've got to be very confused, because they believe he's the Messiah, and he's said he's the Messiah, but he's also told them he's going to suffer and die. And perhaps as a little jolt of encouragement and energy to these disciples, Jesus is transfigured before them. He is seen glorified once more. But in that moment, the voice from the cloud says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And part of what he's been saying is that in addition to the glory of the miracles that he has been doing, he will suffer and die. And so, as they're leaving the mountain, Jesus says, "Do not tell anybody what you have seen until after the Son of Man rises from the dead. Because at that point, you will understand the whole story. For as much as you want to separate success from struggle and failure, and to see success only as the glory that comes to you, I, Jesus, see glory as both success and struggle and failure together. Because Jesus is not glorified because he is successful. Jesus is glorified because he is the beloved Son of God. Now, as we gather today, many of you may be aware that this is a weekend that activists have called for a ceasefire from murders in our city. We've had over 200 homicides so far this year. There was a rally for this ceasefire right up here on Edmondson and Wildwood. And there have still been shootings this weekend. And so it's only natural that many might scoff at the idea of calling for a ceasefire, thinking, well, how would that be effective or even successful? Is it even possible to eliminate the violence in our city? And you could ask that same question about all of the major difficulties we face in society, whether it's violence or poverty or racism. These problems are going to require our constant efforts to address them, because they're always full of roadblocks and setbacks. And so it's understandable that we often wonder whether we can ever solve these problems, whether there's even any point in trying to do so. But you see, if success becomes the measure of our value and our worth in our efforts, then we will become discouraged and we will walk away. We'll conclude that our struggles are just simply a sign of failure and that there's nothing we can do to succeed. And then we will feel abandoned and we will give up our efforts to change anything. You see, and that's when the story of the Transfiguration has to speak to us. Because for as much as Jesus knew success and achievement in his ministry, he also knew suffering and death. He's glorified before his disciples not in spite of his suffering and death, but because of his suffering and death, because of his faithfulness in living the word of his Father. So that in our addressing of the hard issues today, we have to remember that glory will come not in our success alone, but in our faithfulness in confronting the violence and poverty and injustice in our world. Perhaps we can just simply refrain our issue from solving or eliminating problems to just improving our situation, just making it a little bit better than it was before. You see, solving and eliminating requires success all by itself, while improving our situation gives us permission to allow struggle and glory to exist side by side. So success isn't always a good thing. In fact, success can be defeating. Whether we're millennials struggling in the workplace, or whether we're just ordinary folks trying to navigate our lives from one challenge to another, if we believe that glory comes only to those who succeed, then we'll never be able to sustain ourselves in addressing the issues of our day. But Jesus is the Messiah, and God identified him as his beloved Son, not because he would succeed at everything he did. God glorified the Son because he was faithful to his task in both his successes and his suffering. And God will sustain us as his beloved children as well, not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. Amen.